Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy and editor of Providence, a journal of Christian realism, with the pleasure today of conversation with the author of a very interesting new book, relevant for our own times. He is Paul Sparrow, and his book is Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. Paul Sparrow is the former director of the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. Paul, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
The title of your book, The Awakening of the Spirit of America, obviously is contrasting FDR's articulation, the spirit of America, with his nemesis, whose plane was famously the spirit of St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh. Explain that battle to us a little bit.
Well, America in the 1930s was sort of broken by the Great Depression. We had massive unemployment. It looked like, the whole idea around capitalism might have been broken. There had been a strong anti-immigrant trend and a very, very strong isolationist trend, of which Charles Lindbergh eventually sort of became the spokesperson for. Um, and FDR's first priority on becoming president in 1933 was to try to fix the economy, try to bring America back economically, put people to work. But by the late 1930s, it became clear to him that, Hitler and fascism, totalitarianism posed an existential threat, not just to American democracy, but democracy everywhere. Um, but the American public was very opposed to getting involved in this European war. And so in FDR's mind, some of the core values, the spirit of America has to do with the fact that we welcome immigrants, that we are a nation of immigrants, and that we are a country which its most basic DNA was that we are willing to fight for freedom, right? Revolutionary War was all about declaring our independence from a monarchy, a totalitarian regime of a sort, and that he knew that he would have to awaken that spirit of America and convince Americans that it was in their best interest in the long run to help preserve freedom and democracy in Europe and around the world. We couldn't just hide behind, the two oceans and live in our own little bubble. That wasn't possible. And so my book basically starts, on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invades Poland and goes through to a little bit after Pearl Harbor, because it represents this sort of remarkable degree of leadership by Franklin Roosevelt to shift public opinion, and when the war first started, 70% of Americans didn't want to get involved. And by the time Pearl Harbor happens, FDR had shifted public opinion to the point where about 70% of Americans did think America should support the Allies.
So Charles Lindbergh obviously was an international hero who had been the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, and he took advantage of his celebrity and mass admiration to be the icon of the America First movement, which opposed any U.S. help for the Allies in World War II, much less actively intervening in the war. How many Americans supported America First and Charles Lindbergh at the height of their popularity?
Well, it's a good question. It's a little bit hard to answer, empirically, but the America First, in the middle of 1941, had over 800,000 supporters. So that's sort of some indication. But I think the broader support for the isolationist movement was more than half of America. And Lindbergh's entry into this debate is really quite fascinating. He became this global celebrity after he flew across the Atlantic. And then he became an even bigger celebrity after his young son was kidnapped and murdered. But he was so hounded by the press that he fled the United States in 1935 and moved first to England and then to France and lived in Europe during the late 1930s. And during that time, because he was the world's most famous aviator, a number of countries asked him to come in and test their planes. So he went to Germany and he flew the German warplanes. He went to England, France, and he was very impressed with German efficiency and the organization and the dynamism he saw in Hitler's Germany. And he was very discouraged by what he described as the old empire decadence of France and England and their refusal to sort of understand what was happening and that they were falling behind the military rearmament of Germany. So in 1939, he comes back to the United States. And when war breaks out, uh, in the beginning of September, FDR goes on the radio and does this speech about how, our United States official policy is one of neutrality, but I can't ask American citizens to be neutral in they have to follow their own conscience and decide which side they think is right. And just a week and a half later, Lindbergh goes on the radio for the first time in years. He's so famous that he basically, a friend of his calls up, the radio networks and say, "Hey, Lindbergh wants to give a speech. Will you carry it?" And so it was carried, nationally. And he comes out and says, America should not get involved in this war. And everybody was sort of shocked on some level that he would take such a stance and so blatantly go against the president of the United States. And then over the next, 2 years, he just becomes increasingly aggressive in his positions and in his attacks on FDR's policies. Now, at that point, when he first comes on the radio, like I said, a vast majority, 70% of Americans agreed with him. Most people were isolationist at that point. Like I said, the Great Depression had broken the spirit. A lot of Americans were mad at the French and the British for not paying back their World War I loans. And they certainly, didn't want that right at this moment where it appeared we were finally coming out of the horror of the Great Depression to get involved in some foreign war. So really a majority of Americans supported Lindbergh. Over time, as the brutality of the war in Europe became more obvious, and when the fall of France and the Japanese atrocities in the Pacific Ocean, more and more Americans started to see what it was that FDR is talking about. So my book very much follows the war of words between these two men and what they represented in terms of who are we going to be as a people? What does it mean to be an American? And they had very different viewpoints. And of course, over the course of this period, Lindbergh's anti-Semitism becomes more and more obvious until he comes right out and says, it's the Jews that are trying to force us into this war. And that really undermined his position with a lot of people. FDR was very careful to make sure that it was never positioned as we need to go and fight this war to save the Jews. He was very careful about that because he knew, again, at that point, a majority of Americans were anti-Semitic. Again, Lindbergh wasn't alone. He was speaking for a lot of Americans when he expressed this distrust and distaste for Jews. And so I think there was a very careful strategy on Roosevelt's part where he talks about the oppressed people who are not just Jews, but all of the people of these countries that have been overrun by the Nazis. They're all victims here. We're fighting for the freedom of all people. And so that became very much, and FDR was a brilliant wordsmith, and he had a great team around him, and he knew how to deliver these speeches to convince the American public of what it was that they were facing if they did not take action. His famous arsenal of democracy, the idea is we have to arm the allies in the freedom-loving world so that they can fight the war in Europe. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting the war here in America.
So as you say, Americans were dispirited by the Depression. They were cynical from the results of World War I. Almost certainly the vast majority of people, at least the public persons associated with America First, would say they had no sympathy with Nazi Germany. But is it safe to say they certainly underestimated the scope of the evil that Nazi Germany was enmeshed with? did not understand what was unfolding against the Jews and others, and were perhaps themselves pessimistic or less than enthusiastic about American democracy. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the construct at that moment was that, these dynamic new forms of government like communism and fascism and socialism and totalitarianism were casting doubt on the viability of democracy itself. And this was something that FDR really pushed back against quite strongly. But Lindbergh's wife, for example, to give you some, sort of context, Lindbergh was attacked by a lot of FDR supporters and by the people who were interventionists, is what they were called. And so his wife, Anne, who was a very acclaimed author in her own right, had written a number of best-selling books. She put out this book in the summer of 1940 called Wave of the Future, which was her sort of defense of her husband's point of view. And incredibly, her argument was that, we're going through one of those transitional moments, and democracy is a failed system of the past, and fascism is the wave of the future. And that the Nazis are just scum on the surface of the wave, which will eventually pass, and then we'll be left with this new form of government, which is dynamic with the powerful leader, and that can help us prevent another Great Depression. And of course, she was pretty roundly attacked for that point of view, saying that fascism is the wave of the future. But again, there were a lot of people in America who supported not just isolationism, but directly supported Nazi Germany, that they thought that that was a viable form of government. There were multiple groups in this country, the Bund, the German Bund, neo-Nazi groups, armed militia who wanted to overthrow the government of the United States. There was a very strong pro-German, pro-Hitler movement in this country during that period.
Did Lindbergh himself have political ambitions? And if so, was he an authoritarian?
Well, two good questions, but slightly different answers. The Republican Party, so FDR decided he was going to run for a third term in 1940 after Germany conquers France. So in May of 1940, he says, "Okay, I'm going to run for a third term," which was highly controversial. No one had ever run for a third term. It wasn't the law then the way it is now, but it was very controversial. And so the Republicans went to Lindbergh and said, will you be our candidate for president and run against Roosevelt? We think you can beat him. And Lindbergh said, no, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to be beholden to a political party. I want to speak for myself. I want to have my truth that I advocate. And he turned him down. And then, of course, the Republicans ended up going with Wendell Willkie. So he did not have political ambitions in the traditional sense. He felt that his role was to be a voice for the American people who shared his point of view. Now, was he an authoritarian? That's a more nuanced question, but I think, yes, I think he believed that democracy and a free press, he had suffered at the hands of a free press after his son was died, and he really hated the media. I think he felt that a strong authoritarian leader who had control over how the government worked would be an improvement over the messiness of participatory democracy.
And I know it's hard to generalize, but if you had to break down America's demographics and how they divided over whether to support the Allies or not, is it fair to say the Northeast, the Eastern Seaboard, and the South were more in favor of helping the Allies against Nazi Germany, and isolationism was deeply rooted in the Midwest?
That's in sort of a very simplistic way. Yes, that's sort of the way the geographic support went, but it was more complicated than that. There were a lot of Southern Democrats who opposed FDR's policies, who were isolationists. and there were a lot of conservative Republicans who supported intervention because they understood the role of America as a leader in the free world, and they thought that America had a moral imperative to take action here. So it was, I mean, in 1940, FDR appointed a Republican to be the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy, one of whom had run against him as the vice president in the 1936 election. So FDR really was trying to build a bipartisan coalition around these bigger themes of the spirit of America. What does it mean to be America? America's role of leadership in the world. And so it was broken up. Now, there were certainly strong opposition in the middle of the country, particularly sort of the northern Midwest, where there were a lot of Germans, a lot of Scandinavians, a lot of sort of Northern Europeans who did not want their sons to go fight another war. And there were a lot of people on the East Coast who were businessmen like Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, people like that, who had business interests in Germany and wanted to do business. They thought, we can do business with Hitler. We can do business with these guys. And so it was a very complex matrix of who was supporting FDR, who was supporting Lindbergh, and what their motivations were for that support. I mean, William Randolph Hearst, one of the great newspaper magnates of his time, and Colonel Robert McCormick in Chicago, they really strongly supported Lindbergh and the isolationist movement. So you had this powerful right-wing media force. You had these very, very wealthy industrialists like Henry Ford, all supporting Lindbergh's efforts. So it was a unique challenge to the authority of the president.
You may not address this in your book, but was there any kind of major religious divide on support the Allies versus being isolationist? Did Catholics feel differently from Protestants, or Episcopalians differently from the Midwestern Lutherans, or is that hard to say?
I don't have data on that. There's no question that there was a strong anti-war movement within the religious community. Because the horrors of World War I were fresh. Only 20 years since the war had ended, the war to end all wars, and so there was, and the original America First movement actually was a campus protest, an anti-war campus movement that started at Yale with some very liberal people. Sargent Shriver, Gerald Ford, Stuart Potter, who became a Supreme Court justice. And it was sort of taken over by these more radical, anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi forces. So there was a lot of, in the beginning, particularly a lot of moral objections, religious objections to war itself, and to this war in particular. I think Southern Baptist, on one hand, tended to be isolationist. On the other hand, they were very patriotic and very militaristic, and a large percentage of our military was made up of young men from the South. But you also had the tradition of West Point and Annapolis, and the WASP upper class, commitment and sense of responsibility that they had to be leaders and to step forward in a time of war. So Teddy Roosevelt's son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., served in the war and supported Roosevelt, even though he was a Republican and Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. So it was a very complicated matrix. And I don't think you can easily say that the religious forces were aligned against it. Very similar to the Vietnam War, where you had some factions, like elements of the Episcopal Church, that opposed the war, and the more conservative elements of the Episcopal Church supporting the president. And you saw the same thing in the Catholic Church and all of the different denominations. So it's often more regional than it is national.
Is the national debate ultimately settled by events in terms of German and Japanese aggression, or is it chiefly FDR's powers of persuasion and some embarrassing statements by the America First people?
Well, I think FDR, essentially built the foundation on which the change could happen. He dramatically ramped up our military spending, tried to rebuild the military, tried to convince Americans of what our role needed to be. But there's no question. I mean, the attack on Pearl Harbor ended the isolationist movement overnight. I mean, the next morning they disbanded America First. People who opposed FDR's policy flooded to, induction centers. People volunteered, joined the army. It was a moment of true national um, transformation. And at that point, there was no going back. There were still hardcore isolationists who opposed FDR for many reasons. My book details a number of the congressmen and senators who were working secretly with the Nazis to undermine Roosevelt. So there was a lot of shenanigans going on. But the vast majority of the American public immediately said, as a matter of fact, Lindbergh himself said this, on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, that, the United States has been attacked by force of arms, and by force of arms, we must respond. We must come together and defend ourselves. So that was sort of the overwhelming response by the American people.
The isolationist perspective, was this a moment unique in American history arising from the Depression and the aftermath of World War I, or is this a constant perspective that's been in America from the very beginning and always will resurface?
There's no question there's been an isolationist thread throughout American history, even from the right after the Revolutionary War, when there was this whole question about between Adams and Jefferson, should we support the French? Should we support the English in these battles? And many Americans were like, a pox on both their houses, let's stay out of these European conflicts. Um, but the Americans had to build a navy to protect their shipping and their industry. Um, and so, that thread, you see it, emerge during the period of manifest destiny when Americans said, well, America is this unique country. We have this whole continent. We can massacre Indians. We can take their land. We can move across the country because this is our destiny. And so they became very inwardly focused, particularly as the further you got away from the coast. Now, along the coast, obviously, a lot of the economy was based on trade, trade with Europe. So they tended to be much more um, open to the idea of America as a global player, whereas many other people, particularly farmers and ranchers in the Midwest and the West, felt that America should be its own separate entity and that we shouldn't get involved in these foreign crises, which of course happened. And then during Civil War, during World War I, you see this thread emerge time and time again throughout our history. And again, after World War II, and you're seeing it again right now, where America's pulling back and saying we don't want to be involved in these foreign countries. We should be focused on our own welfare and economy.
Paul, could you hold up a copy of your book?
Sure. Here's the book. I hope you'll go out and read it and enjoy it. It's gotten a great response so far. One of the things that people are surprised a little bit is how often FDR uses spiritual references in his speeches. And he refers to the spirit of America, and not just a religious way, but also in a sort of a philosophical way. But he doesn't use religion as a way to say Jesus says do this. It's more that he uses biblical references to provide a moral framework for the actions he thinks Americans need to take. And it's very interesting. He had a big debate with his speechwriters in the speech where he really came out and he's talking about the spirit of America, the soul of America. And his speechwriters say, "You don't say that. You got to stop saying that. It's too religious." And they kept crossing it out, and he kept putting it back in because he really felt that would resonate with the American public. Because at that point, 90% of Americans went to church every Sunday. We were a very Christian, very religious country. And so he understood that those references that he would make that people would understand, were going to be very important to them picking up this mantle of global leadership. I mean, and he was the one that, really set us up to become the world's first superpower.
Paul Sparrow, author of Awakening, the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. Thank you very much for an edifying conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on.